Folks, welcome to Lecture 5 in this 8-part series of lectures on New Testament Christology. We've covered a lot of ground up to this point, and now we're going to home in on one of the most complex and contested and puzzling questions of the New Testament, of the biblical tradition of earliest Christianity, and really of all philosophical and theological developments in the history of existence. Now, I know that's quite a setup, but it's the question of the origins of Christology. That is, why and for what reasons did the earliest Christians come to the view, and they certainly did come to the view, in the view of some scholars really late in the New Testament period, like in the 90s with the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation and some other texts, in my view and the view of a lot of other scholars, and increasingly so, much earlier than that in the first few years of the Christian movement. But whenever they came to the view, it was nevertheless very early in the history of Christianity, at least in the first century, by all accounts. Why did they come to the view that Jesus was divine? And what sense did that make? And how did they then and therefore try to remain Jewish monotheists and nevertheless ascribe divinity to Jesus? And how did that play out? What an earlier generation of scholars used to say, particularly in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th century, was to say that because first century Judaism was so exclusivist in its monotheism, and because Jesus himself and all of his earliest disciples were monotheists, and because Judea in general was characterized by that Jewish monotheism, those Christians that grew up in that Jewish tradition that stayed round about Judea never really could have come to the fully blown view that Jesus of Nazareth was divine. Even if he'd said some puzzling things about his own person, even if they'd seen him raised from the dead and exalted to heaven, the exclusivist Jewish monotheism of their tradition simply could not have allowed them to come to the views to which later Christianity came. And so they could not come to those views until they moved away from Judea. Geographically, they moved away from the influence of the Jewish tradition, and they got further in time removed away from the Jewish tradition. So somewhere late in the first century and somewhere outside of Judea. Maybe in Antioch, or maybe in Asia Minor, or maybe somewhere else. Possibly, some scholars thought, through the missionary efforts of Paul outside the Judean realm. There was a context in the wider Greco-Roman world of thinking of various figures that had been exalted in one way or another, whether it was the traditions about the Roman emperor or the famous Greek heroes like Achilles, etc. This tradition of figures being exalted up into heaven and being treated as gods. And perhaps the imperial context of that being done for the emperor. The emperors were thought to have been exalted to heaven. Greek heroes were thought to have been exalted to heaven, etc. Perhaps that provided a context within which it made sense for Paul and some of his hearers to say, maybe something like that happened to Jesus of Nazareth. But that could only happen when the context of Jewish monotheism was in some sense left behind. So how did this happen? Why did it happen? In the last 30 or 40 years, scholars have began to question this schema of organizing the origins of Christology and saying, was it really a late development? And did it really happen outside of Judea and not around the earliest Jerusalem-based Jewish disciples? And in particular, a scholar named Larry W. Hurtado, who passed away within the past couple of years, God rest him, magnificent scholar that had an enormous influence on me. He made a very strong case in his work over the last 30 or 40 years and has convincingly argued, along with folks like Richard Bauckham, Crispin Fletcher Louis, N.T. Wright, etc., made a very strong case for saying the evidence suggests that the view that Jesus was actually and truly divine seems to have originated much earlier than that tradition of scholarship thought. It's reflected in some of our earliest New Testament evidence in Paul's letters. the undisputed letters, the authentic letters. And in those letters, not only is a view of Jesus as divine reflected, but it seems to be a view of Paul that he doesn't have to argue for, that he takes for granted, that he seems to share with the Jerusalem apostles. I think that view has a lot going for it, but it immediately raises the question: if Paul believed that Jesus was divine, one might have been able to say, this is a hypothesis, that, well, Paul was a Jew. He was an exclusivist Jewish monotheist, so it's not the older hypothesis of it happening outside of Judea and outside of the bounds of Jewish monotheism. It's still happening within the bounds of Jewish monotheism to Paul the Apostle, but Paul had this dramatic, cataclysmic, visionary experience that we call the Damascus Road experience. Some scholars call it the Damascus Christophany. So Paul has that experience, and maybe that explains Paul's Christology. Well, maybe so. I don't think it quite does to the extent that some scholars think, but even if it did explain Paul's Christology, it wouldn't explain the Christology of the earliest Jerusalem-based disciples who didn't have quite the same experience that Paul the Apostle had. And of course, as I said, Paul seems to assume that they share a view of Jesus as divine. And then one might say, well, okay, Paul has his dramatic Damascus Road Christophany, but surely the earliest Jerusalem-based disciples, so Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, and so the four Gospels tell us, they had visionary experiences of, I want to be careful with saying visionary because that might sound as though it's happening only in the head. No, they had actual, real space-time experiences, so they thought, of Jesus being outside of the tomb in which he was buried outside of Jerusalem. So bodily raised from the dead, not a corpse in the tomb and in some kind of angelic visitation, but the corpse transformed, glorified, outside of the tomb, appearing to them. So these dramatic experiences of seeing the resurrected Jesus, so some might think, convinced the Jerusalem apostles, let's say Peter, James, John, Mary, the rest, that Jesus was divine. But then that raises further questions. Do we have any reason to think that first century Jewish exclusivist monotheists, if Peter, James, and John and the rest were exclusivist Jewish monotheists, and we have very good evidence to suggest that they were, do we have any reason to think that if there were no other reasons to push them to this view, that upon seeing their recently beloved leader bodily glorified and standing in front of them shining, that they would have concluded that he was somehow divine on the same ontological level as the God of Israel? We have no evidence to suggest that. In the Jewish tradition, there were categories by which Jews might have interpreted such resurrection appearance experiences. They might have concluded, as in the case of Enoch in the book of Genesis, that Jesus was righteous before God and he was being taken up into heaven. They might have concluded that, like Elijah, he was being taken up on a chariot to heaven. He was exalted and he was a special righteous member of God's people. There were similar stories told about Moses. There were similar traditions, as in the pseudepigraphical books of Enoch, particularly the book that we call 1 Enoch, has a tradition about a heavenly Enoch figure that's been, as Genesis 5 has it, taken up into heaven. He's righteous and exalted in God's purposes. Perhaps they would have thought that about Jesus. Yes, the fact that he'd been bodily raised would have made them think, this is very strange. What is happening in God's purposes? We have no reason to think that they would have naturally concluded on the basis of these resurrection appearances that Jesus was divine. So where did they get this idea and why? Well, the Spirit had been poured out upon them, yes, but do we have any reason to think that the Spirit would have taken these disciples from a view of Jesus in which he wasn't divine automatically to a view of Jesus in which he was divine? No, we don't. So I think that you simply cannot explain the origins and shape of Christology on the basis simply of post-resurrection hypotheses. Well, they saw Jesus raised and he was magnificently glorious. The Spirit had been poured out, etc., etc. No, what you need to do is make some hypotheses about what the disciples likely thought about Jesus before he was raised from the dead, before indeed he was crucified. I do not think that after Jesus' death and resurrection, the disciples would have concluded that Jesus was divine unless when he was crucified, he had done and said things which had already hauntingly, troublingly, and puzzlingly suggested as much to them. Therefore, the search for the origins of Christology must go back into the life of Jesus himself. I hope that you've enjoyed this much shorter and tighter lecture. I hope it's given you lots to think about. See you next time.